I just want my kids back.
Slogging through the modern state of cinematic universes and synergistic cynicism masquerading as storytelling, it's easy to forget the murkier, meaner groundswell of superheroes that led us here. The Man of Steel may have set things in motion with his selfless heroics before a web slinger and a Wolverine reshaped the box office, but the comic book movies of the 80s and 90s largely belonged to the darker corners of gnarled splash panels. A trauma-warped billionaire, a goth zombie, a jackboot fascist, a mass-murdering Dampier. Whether it was a conscious attempt to lure adult audiences or a reflexive response to the comics are for kids cultural stigma of the time, not so long ago, grown-up anti-heroics ruled the roost. Yet, while Batman became a crossover icon and Blade was ice skating up a hill made of money, the baddest good guy of the bunch couldn't quite catch a break. The Punisher has struck out cinematically with 3 different actors, tackling 3 different eras of the comic, and even fallen afoul of streaming contract disputes and content churn. So I'm here to ask, why can't Frank Castle seem to carve his way into the hearts and minds of the mainstream? Is it down to the character, the quality, or is it something else entirely? If just 5% of the subscribers to this channel donated $1 a month over at Patreon, we'd be entirely sustainable and free to make videos about whatever we like.
I wish I was dead! Oh!
Listen, wait, listen.
While different iterations, retcons, and reboots have chopped and changed the details, every Punisher generally marches to the same core narrative beats. Frank Castle, a battle-hardened veteran turned peacetime family man, narrowly survives an attack that kills his wife and children. Battered, broken, and out for blood, Castle breaks bad and sets about murdering any and all criminals that get between him and his insatiable, white skull on a black t-shirt brand of justice.
They don't deserve punishment. They deserve punishment.
First off the theatrical bat is 1989's The Punisher. I'm not going to spend too much time talking about this one because, to put it bluntly, it's not good. Not a fascinating dumpster dive, not worthy of comparative or analytical discussion, just dime a dozen end of an era trash. The Punisher 1989 disregards every ounce of what makes Frank Castle so compelling, and not just narratively. This doesn't even function as superficial fan service. He's not even wearing the Skull t-shirt. What's left is admittedly daft, but rarely enjoyable, out with a hopelessly lost-looking Dolph Lundgren.
Where is the dope coming into?
A man who imbues every wooden word with more obstinate oak than you'd find elsewhere in this loose assemblage of papier-mâché plotting and dollar store sets.
Do you think I give a shit?
Instead of the beefed-up Sid from Toy Story the fandom may be used to, this take on the character lands somewhere between Red State stepdad who blew your college fund on a motorbike, and disquieting weirdo who kisses his gun before he goes to bed. Rather than even the lip service of an adaptation, this is an inflated pig's bladder of dude bro vengeance, with only the most tenuous veins tying it to the post-traumatic dark night of the soul from whence it came. Toss out the title card and call it That's So Reagan, and you'd have a radioactive time capsule of everything culturally bankrupt about the 80s. The Punisher 1989 is a largely forgotten novelty, a failure by every conceivable metric that couldn't even score a stateside theatrical release. After this, it'd be a lean 15 years until we got a second crack at the Man in Black. With an armed-to-the-teeth Thomas Jane, John Travolta's hairpiece, and a dye job Kevin Nash, it was time to say welcome back Frank with 2004's The Punisher. While there's no denying that The Punisher 2004 is a messy, imperfect romp, as an ode to the smudged ink and eager violence of Garth Ennis' seminal Marvel Knights run, it's hard to fault what the creative team here chose to update, edit, and wholesale replicate. The changes are largely born of set-piece building necessity, or slight concessions to matters of taste. Frank Castle's tragic backstory is upgraded from dad loses wife and kids to family man witnesses the systematic eradication of his entire bloodline. A hired thug who gets barely half a page in the comics is elevated to hitman Johnny Cash. And while Frank's ragtag misfit neighbours are admittedly little more than thinly sketched silhouettes that serve to contrast against Mr. Doom and Gloom here, that's more than can be said of the insipid or outright offensive archetypes they're based on. It's also worth noting that, 20 years ago, a C-tier Marvel property managed to organically incorporate a queer character as the secondary villain, without it feeling like a broad caricature or a condescending footnote. A lesson that, 2 decades on, Marvel's new corporate overlords keep screwing up.
Woo! Woo! You just keep hitting the f***ing home runs, Disney!
I'd also be remiss if I didn't pour praise on this absolutely wonderful brawl with this perfectly goofy powerhouse known simply as the Russian. Almost a shot-for-shot, panel-by-panel recreation of one of the comic's most famous encounters, I love every gratuitous goofball minute of it.
Did you feel that?
None of which would hold together if it wasn't for Thomas Jane's thoughtful take on a character who, by design, is often methodically one note.
Shouldn't play with knives.
Eschewing brick shithouse stature for the wiry athleticism of a damaged but ever dangerous man who's tipped over the verge, Jane pushes on the pressure points between Castle's camouflaged humanity and the 1,000-yard stare of a driven sociopath. Bringing a neo-western sensibility with his guns at noon, Lone Ranger strut, that, for my money, is still the high watermark for this material.
This is not vengeance. Revenge is not a valid motive, it's an emotional response. Not vengeance. Punishment.
It's a shame then that for every tasteful touch of fan service and earnest attempt to capture the contrast of sour-faced grimness and gallows humour that defines the most celebrated runs of this character, the whole thing still feels 2 or 3 rewrites away from its full potential. The pacing lurches without much in the way of emotion or meaning for most of the second act. The dialogue seesaws between the overly dry and obnoxiously bad.
He misses his family and he wants to die. He's asking for help, so let's help him.
This shot looks like the worst new metal album cover never made, and there are maybe 20 minutes of action stretched over a 2-hour runtime, or 140 minutes if you're watching the slog of an extended cut. Finally, there's the most ill-advised change from the page to screen. John Travolta's woefully bland, do-nothing bad guy. The The Punisher 2004 was coming off the back of this man's decade on the lunatic fringes of eternally memorable heels. So to see such an underwritten placeholder gangster square off against Jane's anti-heroic disciplinarian is like asking the Batman to fight it out with Gil from The Simpsons.
Thank you for that explanation.
Now, this is all down to the fact that no studio in its right mind was ever going to finance an adaptation of the Welcome Back Frank comic book with its original villain, mob boss Ma Nucci, a megalomaniacal matriarch who Castle dispatches by luring Ma Nucci to a zoo, antagonizing a polar bear until it eats her arms and legs, then yeeting her quadriplegic frame into a burning house. What I'm saying is, Lionsgate are cowards who denied us all the chance to watch Thomas Jane punching a polar bear in the face.
I think that would be a little dangerous.
I'd get a kick out of it.
Despite its wonky inconsistencies, looking back at this after over 15 years of the now MCU's market-tested smarm and CGI safety, The Punisher 2004 is a refreshing, idiosyncratic Death Wish tribute that at least has the wherewithal to take weird chances and stumble in pursuit of something good. The same of which I can say for its reboot/sequel, Punisher Warzone, a pulsating globule of mean-spirited viscera from the publisher of Squirrel Girl.
Hey, what's the matter?
A recast, revamped, and revolting taste of what we could have had if Marvel went grindhouse, Punisher Warzone is still the most violent movie ever to bear Stan Lee's name, this time adapting the more ruthlessly nihilistic and grotesquely gory Punisher Max imprint of the comics. So instead of interrogating suspects with popsicles and sitting down for Sunday dinner, he disintegrates his enemy's flesh with industrial glass blenders and wallops people so hard their heads explode. And I'd be lying to myself and to you if I didn't admit that I think all of this is extremely badass. Badass in the same way I used to think stage diving at Converge shows or getting high and blowing up deodorant cans was fun, sure. But it's hard to intellectualize the head rush of idiotic abandon when it feels so immediately satisfying in the moment. Punisher Warzone is, and I mean this with all the affection I can muster, a snuff cartoon for morons. The violence veers beyond squibs and shrapnel into straight-out splatter territory. The soundtrack is a noxious slurry of butt rock, new metal, and frat house EDM, and the undefinable accents are borderline experimental in their badness.
He does to those bastards what me and you can only fantasize about.
Speaking of the performances, while I think Ray Stevenson does a solid job both looking and acting the part, with the grizzled determination of a well-armed refrigerator that spends his days chewing sand, I do wish Thomas Jane had thrown himself into the feature-length fray for a second time. On the upside, the void of Jane's absence is filled by Dominic West's Jigsaw.
You look fantastic, brother.
From his Billy the Beaut origins to a very cute nod to Tim Burton's Batman, and onwards and upwards with each escalating moment of scenery-suckling mania, it feels like a gloriously overkill course correction from the vacuous charisma hole John Travolta left behind last time around.
What do you want from us?
I'm looking for my money.
We don't have it, I swear to God.
How about you, sweet cheeks? Would you also like to swear on an imaginary friend?
God bless you for your deranged commitment to being very, very strange. Stylistically, Warzone is by far the most aesthetically ambitious translation of this material. Near enough every shot comes smeared in snotty greens, bile yellows, or rupturing burgundy. Every set looks like a death trap or claustrophobic killing floor, and the neon-bathed nights outnumber the warm days by 10 to 1. Coloured gels and set dressing aside, this is very much meat and potato stuff. Now, I happen to like mince and tatties just plenty.
God be with you, Frank.
Sometimes I'd like to get my hands on God.
The problem comes when you're expected to shovel it down for every meal. Contrary to what Frank Castle might believe, a ball-peen hammer isn't the right tool for the job 100% of the time. Warzone has no intention of anything beyond maximising casualties, interspersed with the occasional sour-faced reminder that this dude's kids are indeed sleeping in a bleached grave.
Bummer.
What I'm saying is, it bottles the edgelord lightning of the Punisher Max series authentically and without diluting the intoxicating imbecility and reckless abandon of its tongue-in-cheek nastiness. And that's both its crowning achievement and unshakable limp. So it'll come as a surprise to absolutely no one that Lionsgate once again had no idea how to market or promote a Punisher movie. If Thomas Jane's Sad Dad Turned Mad Lad was a box office disappointment, Warzone was a disaster that all but kneecapped the franchise for 8 years. That is, until Disney and Netflix took one look at Jon Bernthal and said, hey, now that's the kind of guy we'd like to see beat some dudes to death with some gym equipment. After a supporting appearance in Netflix's Daredevil, which served as both the highlight of a very mixed season and a further testament to just how well they cast those shows, The Punisher was handed a well-earned spin-off. And it's the adaptation I'm honestly the most conflicted on. Castle's gravelly scene stealing was the perfect foil for Matt Murdock in Daredevil, as a peripheral threat turned uneasy alliance. When stretching that forlorn intensity over almost 26 hours of television though, Season 1 tries to retrofit the Punisher into a convoluted paranoid thriller about shadowy Black Ops teams and NSA whistleblowers, and while Season 2 works better for me, and I did appreciate the in-all-but-name inclusion of the Mennonite, too often it all feels like it's trying to force 200 pounds of bloody hamburger meat into a prestige TV envelope.
I think we're being too smart's what I think.
And by we you mean me,
Yeah,
right?
you're goddamn right.
The Punisher's moral absolutism and gunpowder outlook are invigorating and effective in short, sharp bursts, be it as a standalone movie, short film, or supporting turn that punctuates an already established world. The cracked knuckle simplicity is still here in the terrific fight scenes, and Bernthal dials into the tragedy and turbulence of Castle's ravaged mind flawlessly, but its sandpaper harshness always feels at odds with the sterile digital sheen that renders it indistinguishable from the rest of the bloated content mill. It's a series that has this relentless urge to ground the grotesque farce of the Punisher's crusade in that homogeneous sheen of the current Marvel machine. An adherence to clean decorum that leaves Jigsaw, who lest we forget is called that because he's essentially a mangled mess of skin and sinew, looking like the most handsome man you've ever seen, albeit with a few beauty marks.
Look, I get it, okay? I do.
Netflix's crack at the Punisher is okay, with a lead performance and fight choreography team that are genuinely fantastic. But just like the rest, it just serves to remind me how we've yet to see the perfect Punisher. When you pick apart the Punisher, be it his early appearances, War Journal, the Garth Ennis revival, his current comic book iterations, or each vastly different on-screen incarnation. He works best as an efficient, aggressive wad of gristle and hypocrisy. An authorially brazen stab at vigilantism, cyclical patterns of violence, and any number of right-wing power fantasies. However, this one-dimensionality becomes a problem when your broad-shouldered avatar that mainly just grunts and then shoots poor people is constantly referencing and drawing upon prescient, real-world issues. Even the most celebrated takes on the Punisher have struggled with the wider implications and moral consequences of the character's actions and existence.
We don't get to pick the things that fix us, Red. Make us whole.
In the first Marvel Knights compendium of his Punisher run, Garth Ennis even includes an epilogue where he weirdly brags about his own ignorant indifference to anything beyond writing cool scenarios in which Castle can slaughter drug dealers. Oh, he also enjoys occasionally dabbling in transphobia and writing one of the most racist characters to ever exist under the Marvel banner.
Oh no.
While I don't think everything needs to be an intellectual lightning rod or a jumping off point for broader political debates, I've never been able to shake the thought that the Punisher is the ideal candidate for just that sort of thing. And Garth Ennis has proven he can do this. Shout out to the character Mr. Payback, who answers the question, what if the Punisher took out the corrupt billionaires, corporate officials, and governing bodies that actually cause all this mess? Punisher Born, a 4-issue limited series that serves as an origin story, and alludes to mental illness and a sick sense of gratification being the reason Frank likes killing so much, and also a well-earned nod to one of the best arcs in the entire series, being one of the few runs that explicitly questions the efficacy and cruelty of the Punisher's systematic annihilation of the substance-dependent and people without homes, and his refusal to offer any shot at rehabilitation or recovery.
Mr. Punisher, sir.
95% of all work featuring the Punisher fails to address or acknowledge that Castle is attacking the symptoms rather than the disease of rampant societal decay, inequality, radicalized anti-intellectualism, and misplaced hatred. It's in these grey areas and paper-thin shoot-em-all-and-let-God-sort-them-out gutters that the most hate-filled, idiotic chuds and hair-trigger oops-I-turned-my-body-cam-off cops on the planet have co-opted the Punisher as a new Don't Tread on Me symbol. This is despite co-creator Jerry Conway's assertion that the Punisher is a bit of a Rorschach test as to whether you're a shitty human being. Garth Ennis' wholesale condemnation of the absolute losers who appropriate his logo, and the non-bootlicking part of the human brain that would typically chime in and say, hey, maybe gunning down everyone who doesn't adhere to your subjective code of conduct is dumb as shit. All of which has slathered the Punisher, which I'll remind you is a comic book and film series I really do like, with a toxic, amorphous stink that it can't really do anything to shed.
Obviously, you're upset.
Upset? Is that the word?
So, do I think there's a perfect Punisher property out there beyond the must-have paperbacks and essential issues of its 50-year run? Well, the PlayStation 2 game gets extremely close, and I really want someone to remake it.
I need a drink.
Then there's Thomas Jane's unofficial swan song, Dirty Laundry, a short film that reunites him with his White Skull shirt and kicks so much ass you'll be tasting your own tuchus on the back of your tongue.
You know the difference between justice and punishment.
What?
As for the mainline theatrical and television releases, this one just outright sucks, and all the rest have a lot to offer, but none are outright successes as adaptations or standalone additions to the pantheon of vigilante schlock cinema. That being said, If someone was to take the lessons learned and certifiable strengths of each attempt and combine them into some kind of Franken-Castle monster,
I understood that reference.
then we'd be cooking with a blowtorch. The Punisher 2004's Thomas Jane and willingness to embrace both the relentless and wackier sides of the source material. Warzone's grindhouse grime and gonzo villainy. The Netflix show's bludgeoning tactility and gruff demeanour. Nail-gun them together, trim the dead weight, and engage with the moral complexities rather than pushing them off to one side. Now that's something I'd gladly pay big dumb money to watch over and over again. For as simple a figure as he is ethically, morally, and conceptually, it turns out that pulling the Punisher from the ink and escapism of cartoons and comics into an approximation of the real world and all of its implications is no easy feat.
You know, I keep turning it all over in my head and I keep coming up with the same conclusion.
I truly believe that Thomas Jane and Ray Stevenson's efforts deserve far better than the critical beating they both unfairly received, and I'm glad to see that Jon Bernthal's getting another crack at the character. Because despite the dumbass fringes of his fanbase, and more than a few shots that missed their mark, Frank Castle is an anti-hero that's well worth saving. A stylish trench coat for our Patreon producers Jennifer C, Claire MD, Becky O, Hales and Rue, Historically Dumb, Scared Confusion, Jake R, and Nicholas LeRevere, and a bummed out angry scowl for all these amazing folks who support us over on Patreon. So what's your history with the Punisher series, and how would you go about making a Punisher movie? If you're in a position to do so, consider checking out our Patreon, where you can sign up to our film club, get your name in the end credits, and become a member of our private Discord. As always, thank you for watching. Until next time, this is In Frame Out.